Do this in remembrance of me, memory, cognitive neuroscience, and embodied remembrance of God in liturgical action. Would you please welcome Buki Fatona. Thank
you. Get my water. Yes, I'd like to begin by saying thank you to the conveners of this seminar for the invitation, to the Humane Philosophy Project and the Ian Ramsay Centre. It's a wonderful opportunity and I'm delighted to be here today. In this lecture, I will explore the implications of a constructivist model of memory for liturgical theology. Recent findings in cognitive neuroscience challenge the classical model of memory in philosophy as a storage device, wherein experiences are imprinted as onto a wax tablet and reproduced when remembering. It appears, however, that remembering past events consists in active reconstructions in the present in a similar manner and via the same mechanisms as imagining the future. This means, counterintuitively perhaps, that one can successfully simulate memory of an event without a prior experience of that event. Further, as I argue, and drawing on an enactivist theory of cognition, active reconstructions of the past in memory are simulated via an organism's sensory-motor interactions with and navigations of its environment. A constructivist-enactivist model of memory has hitherto unexplored implications for liturgical theology. In exploring these implications, I go on to argue that anamnesis, that is the liturgical action of celebrating the Eucharist in remembrance of Christ, is better explained by a constructivist-enactivist model of memory than by the classical model. But first, some delimitations and glossing of terms. Although I'm reading for a DPhil in theology, my research lies in science and religion, and it brings together my degrees in microbiology, theology, epistemology, ethics, philosophy of mind, and cognitive science. My primary methodology is analytic philosophy. My focus is on Christian liturgical praxis and the Eucharist in particular. So I know that there are people here from liturgical traditions other than Christian tradition, and I very much look forward to insights that you bring from your respective traditions. In theology, embodiment means, or it seems to mean, having a body and the implications of that. However, in philosophy, embodiment in relation to embodied cognition is more tightly defined. Embodied cognition, as I use it, and as it is used in philosophy, means the generation of cognition via an organism's navigation of and its embeddedness within its environment. The kinds of memory, or the kind of memory I'm concerned with in this lecture is episodic memory. That is memory of events, such as of a lecture I attended last week. Contrast episodic memory with semantic memory, which is memory of facts, such as yellow is a color. So this lecture is in three parts. In the first part, I introduce constructivism in antiquity and explore some theological implications of a constructivist model of memory. In the second part, I characterize a constructivist model of memory in the contemporary context, exploring some of the findings in cognitive neuroscience and in experimental psychology, which seem to support this model of memory. And then in the third and final part, I argue that a constructivist-enactivist model of memory best explains liturgical anamnesis. Constructivism can be traced back to Augustine's Confessiones, although it is only recently gaining ground in contemporary philosophy of memory. The North African Roman Church Father, Augustine of Hippo, is perhaps the greatest Christian philosopher of antiquity. In Book 10 of his autobiographical Confessiones, Augustine situates memory, that is remembering the past, and expectation, that is imagining the future, in the same area of his interior world. This means for him, memory and expectation are co-functional cognitive abilities. Further, Augustine asserts that memory is woven together from stored monomodal images acquired from experience. What I here term monomodal images are sensory images acquired from experience, which are sorted and stored according to their sensory modes of all categories, so gustatory, tactile, auditory, visual, olfactory. Augustine's constructivism is foundational to his epistemic claims concerning divine ontology. For him, God is known and encountered in memory, and a specific kind of memory. As he says, on learning about you, you remain in my memory, and there I discover you. Like memory, future-directed imagination also depends on the weaving together or construction of these monomodal images. By asserting that remembering the past and imagining the future are co-functional, Augustine rejects his contemporaneous leading model of memory, so Plato's wax tablet model. In his Theaetetus, Plato describes memory as analogous to wax tablet, on which experiences are imprinted to be later retrieved as memories. An archival memory view of memory is still, according to Mary Carruthers, the governing model of memory in all Western cultures. I know that the situation is far more complex than Carruthers' estimation, and I shall return to this shortly. The received view of memory in philosophy is contra the Augustinian one, in that memory and expectation are regarded as disparate processes belonging to separate cognitive faculties. Why might Augustine, a sophisticated thinker who often relied on Neoplatonist notions, reject the leading contemporaneous model of memory? I argue that Augustine's rejection is because of the theological significance of a constructivist model of memory over an archival wax tablet model. The primary theological significance of Augustine's constructivist account of memory and expectation is epistemological, on how God is known only in memory. Indeed, how God is known is the primary motivation for his Confessiones. As I see it, there are different strands to the epistemological significance of a constructivist model of memory. The first strand of the theological significance of Augustine's constructivism that I identify is this: how is God known and remembered in the interior world wherein the soul resides, without an embodied experience of God in the exterior world where the body resides? A constructivist model of memory allows Augustine to confidently assert that he knows and remembers God in the absence of an embodied experience of God, because on a constructivist model of memory, experience of an event in the past is not required for remembering that event. In an early letter to a friend, Nebridius, Augustine says this: people think that memory refers to past experiences, but some knowledge is not derived from past experiences, nor known through the senses. Thus, memory does not necessarily refer to the past, and it need not involve images derived from past sense experience. A wax tablet model of memory, wherein remembering is limited to past embodied and finite experiences doesn't account for how God is known and remembered in the absence of a first-person embodied experience of God in the physical world. The second strand of the theological significance of Augustine's constructivism that I identify is this: how does a finite human mind know and remember the infinite being of God? It seems to me that for Augustine, God's boundless being can only be encountered in an infinite memory, although not explicitly noted by him. I infer that for his claim that God is known and encountered in memory to be true, memory must have infinite capacity for God's boundless being. An archival form of memory, limited to a person's past experiences, doesn't allow for God's being within its static and limited dimensions. On the other hand, the dynamic permutations and combinations of a reconstructive memory are potentially infinite. The dynamic infiniteness of a reconstructive kind of memory further supports Augustine's epistemic claims concerning the divine ontology. God's boundless being can be known and encountered within a reconstructive memory's infinite spatiotemporal field. In support of this inference, Augustine asserts that the fields, caves, and hollows of his memory are innumerable. Further, the infinite capacity of memory is consistent with Augustine's assertion that the interior world in which memory is co-extended is infinite. The third strand of the theological significance of Augustine's constructivism I identify is this: for Augustine, and as seen in early medieval church liturgy, eschatology is a recollection of the future. That is, what are taken to be future acts of God are recollected. I think this view of eschatology as recollection comes from an understanding of God as atemporal. Therefore, the things taken to be future acts of God, some when exist. Thus, to think of these acts is to remember them. In alignment with this, Mary Carruthers quotes an anonymous 12th century monk, and I read this out: "The frequent recollection of the city of Jerusalem and of its king is to us a sweet consolation, a pleasing occasion for meditation." A constructivist model of memory, not restricted to the past, explains how the future can be recollected unlike a wax tablet model. In the contemporary context, according to Philippe de Brigard, a philosopher of memory, constructivism is the view that just as remembering consists in piecing together mental simulations of events, imagining future events also consist in piecing together bits of previous events. In the contemporary taxonomy of memory, constructivism sits under post-causal theories of memory. Post-causal theories descend from causal theories, but nonetheless reject the idea that a causal connection with experience is a necessary connection for memory. The version of post-causal theory of memory that I think is closest to Augustine's constructivism is the simulationist model of memory. I find simulationist model appealing because, like Augustine's constructivism, it holds that remembering past events and imagining future ones are co-functional cognitive abilities. That is, remembering just is imagining. When I assert that a cognitive process A is co-functional with another process B, I mean B's functionality is significantly dependent on A's functionality, and A's is significantly dependent on B's, such that a disruption to A's functionality will significantly affect B's functionality and vice versa. Disruptions to A's and B's functionalities are seen in corresponding disruptions in the cognitive phenomena to which A and B give rise. In addition to a certain episodic memory and episodic future-directed imagination as co-functional, simulationism, like Augustine's constructivism, rejects a causal connection between an experience of an event and the remembering of that event. In characterizing its constructivist, simulationist model of memory, Kirkin-McKellen asserts that things remembered need not be things formally perceived or known, in the sense that remembering can, without ceasing to qualify as genuine remembering, in a full, strict sense, give us access to a past episode that goes beyond the access we had at the time at which it occurred. The view that remembering is not limited to past experiences is congruent with Augustine's. In his De Trinitate, he compares his remembering of Carthage, to which he has been in the past, to Alexandria, to which he has not been. He finds both cases of remembering on a par with one another. The difference between both cases of recollection, aside from having experienced one Carthage and not another Alexandria, is that he needs the attestation of those who have been to Alexandria to determine whether his recollection is true. Michaelian, perhaps unknowingly agreeing with Augustine, says, there may even be cases in which the agent remembers an event that he did not even originally experience. Augustine's and Michaelian's shared idea that memory is imaginatively constructed rather than reproduced raises an important question. If remembering just is to imagine, how is episodic memory differentiated from episodic imagination? Due to space limitations, I can only give a short and insufficient answer to this, which is episodic memory simulations aim at actual past events, whereas episodic imagination don't. According to Michaelian, what characterizes an episodic memory is that the relevant representation is produced by a properly functioning episodic construction system, which he identifies as a simulation process. Next, I consider scientific support for a constructivist model of memory. And the first stop is experimental psychology. After Augustine's constructivist account of memory and expectation, the earliest reference I find to a constructivist view of memory is F.C. Bartlett's theory of memory, put forward in 1932. Sir Frederick Bartlett is one of the most influential scientists who contributed to the development of cognitive psychology. In his Remembering, a scientific study in experimental and social psychology, Bartlett presents a range of experiments to test how people remember. Bartlett's experimental angle is radical because before him the focus in memory studies was on contents and nature of memory. Bartlett, however, crafted studies to test how people retrieve memory. So his focus was on memory retrieval rather than just memory content. In setting up his experiments, Bartlett aimed to retain the advantages of an experimental approach, which it's relatively controlled situations, and to keep his study as realistic as possible. To fulfill these aims, Bartlett used material that most people would encounter in everyday life. Under prescribed conditions, subjects were given a narrative or an argumentative prose passage or a sketch or drawing. Subjects are then required to recall the given material after increasingly longer time lapses, so from a few minutes to days, and in the case of one subject, 10 years. the form, order events, style of recall, process of rationalizations, omissions, and transposition of recalled material serve as data to be analyzed and interpreted. What Bartlett found was that there are commonalities in the way subjects recalled material. The most relevant of the commonalities for this lecture is that subjects recalled dominant details and then reconstructed other aspects to form a coherent whole. Bartlett's experiment was paradigm shifting, although it's been challenged in various ways, which I shan't raise. On the face of it, this may sound trivial. However, if one considers memory as reproductive, the idea that aspects of what is remembered is constructed is problematic, particularly for episodic memory. Reconstructed rather than reproduced memory of events challenges Plato's wax tablet model of memory. As Bartlett observes, accuracy of reproduction in a literal sense is the rare exception and not the rule. Consequently, Bartlett concludes that remembering appears to be far more decisively an affair of construction than mere reproductions. And now I turn to cognitive neuroscience. In support of Bartlett's findings, the picture emerging out of the cognitive neurosciences is that memory and imagination are generated via the same or closely related mechanisms. For example, in one neuroimaging study, it was found that there are commonalities between neurological pathways active during vision as well as during imagination. A section of the occipitotemporal cortex, the fusiform gyrus, is activated both by seeing faces and imagining them. This study indicates, at least when it comes to processing faces, imagination and perception are linked cognitive abilities, and also that imagination, recognition, and visualization are linked cognitive abilities. Giving further weight to this study is the case of MH, patient MH. Due to lesions in the occipital lobe, MH has visual agnosia, prosopagnosia, and achromatopsia, so the inability to recognize objects, inability to recognize faces, and absence of color in visual processing. Along with MH's diminished ability to process visual imagery is a concurrent loss of being able to have recollections which involve visual imagery. The loss of both memory with visual imagery as well as damaged visual processing has led to the conclusion that MH's amnesia is a consequence of MH's visual recognition and visual memory deficits. What I think the case of MH demonstrates is the ability to generate visual images relies, at least in part, on recollections involving visual imagery and vice versa. That is, recollections involving visual imagery rely on the ability to generate images, an ability essential for imagination. A functional magnetic resonance imaging study found considerable neurological overlaps between areas activated during the construction and the elaboration of future and past events. In the study, it was found that the left hippocampus was engaged in both the construction of past and future events. This is interesting because the hippocampus is linked to episodic and spatial memory. And yet, and as this study finds, the hippocampus is also required for construction of future directed episodic thinking. Further, there were strong overlaps between regions comprising the autobiographical memory retrieval network, attributable to common processes engaged during elaboration, including self-referential processing, contextual and episodic imagery. The findings are consistent with findings that patients with certain kinds of amnesia also exhibit deficits in future-directed thinking. One such patient is patient DB, who, due to hypoxic brain damage, is incapable of remembering his own personal past. DB can imagine issues and events in the public domain. However, along with memory loss of his personal past, DB is not capable of personal, future-directed imagination. From examinations of the effects of DB's memory loss, it was concluded that neuropsychological dissociations between episodic and semantic memory for the past also may extend to the ability to anticipate the future. Other studies have found a similar correlation between the ability to remember and the ability to imagine. What all these studies show is that personal episodic memory and personal episodic imagining are co-functional processes. Therefore, studies in experimental psychology and findings in cognitive neuroscience seem to support a constructivist model of memory. Nevertheless, I don't think simulationism or constructivism is sufficient to explain memory. In other words, I synthesize simulationism with an enactivist model of memory, a version of embodied cognition. On what I term a simulationist enactivist model of memory, the dynamic reconstructions involved in memory is an embodied process wherein simulations are generated via sensory motor driven perceptual action system. So how does all of this apply to liturgical action? In this third and final section of the lecture, I argue that anamnesis, that is the liturgical action of celebrating the Eucharist in remembrance of Christ, is better explained by a constructivist-enactivist model of memory than by a classical model. Remembering is woven into Christian liturgy. The imperative, remember your baptism, encourages those who have been baptized to think of their identity in Christ. Similarly, Ash Wednesday's imperative, remember you are dust and to dust you shall return, is an invitation to consider the limitations of corporeality and finitude of mortality. In this lecture, I am focused on the role and character of remembering in the Eucharist. I note, however, that these other liturgical remembrances, be it at baptisms or on Ash Wednesday, are also connected to Eucharistic remembering. The Church's practice of the Eucharist has undergone considerable paradigm shifts since its commonly ascribed first celebration, that is the Last Supper. And there are varied postulations on the origins of the Eucharistic praxis. What isn't in doubt, I think, is that the Eucharist seems to have originated from an amalgamation of Jewish and Greco-Roman meal customs. I note that it is inaccurate to ascribe a unified Eucharistic theology to the early Church. Divergences of interpretation and liturgy are evident even in the Gospel accounts of the Last Supper. For example, in the Matthean and Markan accounts, as they were eating, Jesus broke and offered the bread first before offering the wine to his disciples. But according to Luke, the wine was offered first before the bread and then after supper. Jesus took up the wine again and this time accompanied it with the words, "My blood poured out for you." Although it is not obvious in the text if the disciples drank a second time. The admonition, "Do this in remembrance of me," is absent in Matthew and Mark, but a similar commandment is given at the washing of the disciples' feet in John, the only gospel that doesn't contain a Last Supper narrative. Thus, a cohesive Eucharistic practice isn't present in the Gospels. Nonetheless, Eucharistic anamnesis is the cardinal locus of connection between scripture and liturgical praxis. Further, remembrance is a common feature of all varying Orthodox Eucharistic traditions. The Anglican Roman Catholic International Commission, ARCIC, Eucharistic statement brings the theological schism in the apparently polar theologies of traditional Roman Catholicism and 16th century Reformation thinking by stating that Christians gather in the Eucharist to commemorate Christ's saving act and to proclaim the Lord's death until he comes. To proclaim requires remembering. Gregory Dix, in his The Shape of Liturgy, asserts that the Eucharist recalls the sacrifice of Christ. As I see it, an enactivist, constructivist model of memory best explains the type of recollection that takes place in the Eucharist. On an enactivist, constructivist model of memory, remembering the past consists in an active reconstruction in the present in a similar manner and via the same mechanisms as imagining the future in future-directed imagination. Further, active reconstructions of the past are inactive in that memory is generated via an organism's embodied sensory-motor interactions within and navigations of its environment. Similarly, in the Eucharist, the sacrifice of Christ is recollected in liturgical actions that take place in the present, which include the sensing of the altar, the celebrant's gestures and words, approaching the altar with faith and reverence, and receiving the bread and wine as the body and blood of Christ. Eucharistic anamnesis occurs via liturgical actions in the present. In the liturgy of the sacrament, Jesus' admonition, "Do this in remembrance of me," is obeyed. Thus, remembrance is the primary activity. It is a shared rather than individual remembering, a commonly shared exteriorization of what is an interior phenomenon on an individual level. In remembrance of Christ, bread and wine are blessed by the priest and eventually consumed by all those gathered round the altar. Remembering thus is not so much as a mental activity, but an embodied joint activity via a shared memory. The memory is incarnate in those around the altar. Remembering is not limited to reconstructing the past. It includes imagining the future. As the priest pronounces, "Wherefore, O God, we remember Christ's self-offering, we proclaim his mighty resurrection, we look for his coming, the coming of his kingdom, and with this bread and this cup we make a memorial of Christ." In the Eucharistic celebration, remembrance comprises remembering the past, self-offering of Christ, proclaiming the present, resurrected Christ, and looking for the coming future of his kingdom. Liturgical anamnesis thus involves an embodied mental time travel across the temporal landscape of the Christian master narrative. As I see it, the self-projection involved in liturgical anamnesis is a shared activity wherein the self is viewed as tightly bound up with others gathered around the altar through space and time. Paradoxically, the breaking of the body of Christ results in the reconstruction of the church. In addition to being the cardinal locus of connection between scripture and liturgical praxis, Eucharistic anamnesis is an image of God's remembrance. In scripture, when God remembers, it has an ontological effect. That is, God's remembrance is not a mere reproduction of the past, but it is an active creation, reconstruction, and reordering of events. God's remembrance thus is congruent with a constructivist model of memory. In Luke 1, 72, God's remembrance affects the salvation of God's people. That is, by remembering God's covenant, God delivers God's people. Later on in Luke, at the crucifixion of Jesus, Christ's act of remembrance of one of the thieves also being crucified culminates in that thief's entrance into paradise. Similarly, in Hebrews 8:12, God's forgiveness of sins occurs because God chooses to no longer remember those sins. Conversely, in Revelation 18, God's remembrance of Babylon's sins brings about judgment. Eucharistic remembrance is a participation in God's remembrance. I use participation in Plato's sense, wherein a thing or an icon, E, say, is an image of another thing, object, say, O, because E participates in O. In his Timaeus, Plato takes time to be an icon or image of eternity. I term this a participatory likeness, wherein resemblance is not what instantiates E's likeness to O, but participation of E in O. Analogously, in liturgical theology, the Church's dynamic participation in God via Eucharistic remembrance reconstructs the Church into the image of God. Eucharistic remembrance effects a transubstantiation, as it were, of the gathered into Imago Dei. Consequently, the Church's remembrance has ontological consequences like God's remembrance. Another way an enactivist, constructivist model of memory better explains liturgical anamnesis is in relation to time. In the Eucharist, there is an interruption of the past by the future in the now. The Transfiguration narrative instantiates this idea. In Luke 9, after Jesus had been transfigured, two men, Moses and Elijah, appear in glorious splendor, talking with him. What we are witnessing in this narrative is a meeting of the past with the future in the present. Interestingly, Moses and Elijah both had mysterious ends. In Deuteronomy, Moses disappears on Mount Nebo. Similarly, in 2 Kings, Elijah is whisked away by a chariot of fire. Thus, it is consistent with the laws of physics to, via a thought experiment, imagine that on ascending Mount Nebo, Moses steps through a wormhole and arrives in the future into this gospel scene. Similarly, it is possible to imagine the chariot of fire as a biblical TARDIS, which whisks Elijah also into this future scene. Where Moses and Elijah represent the past, Jesus represents the future. The transfiguration of Christ is a prefiguration of his future glory. In alignment with this, we are told that they spoke about his departure, what he was about to bring to fulfillment. In this moment, these three people point us to what is in Christian theology the fulfillment of all time, Christ, who is subsequently described in Revelation as the Alpha and the Omega, the beginning and the end. Thus, whether we conceive of the universe as a spread out manifold with time and space as its static dimensions, in which the past and the future exist in the present, or whether we conceive of the universe as comprising successive moments of the present, in which the past and the future are illusory in the present. In Christian scripture, Jesus Christ, the Alpha and the Omega, is invariably the fulfillment of all time. To quote Father Teilhard de Chardin, the paleontologist and Jesuit priest, Christ is the ultimate point upon which all realities converge. Christ as the ultimate or omega point is what is remembered in Christian Eucharistic celebration. The Eucharist and its celebration of the interruption of the past by the future is best explained by a constructivist model of memory, via which both the past and the future can jointly be remembered. This idea of remembering the future is the final point on which I end this lecture. For Augustine and in subsequent medieval monastic praxis, the eschatological future is recollected. To explain eschatological recollection in late antiquity and in the medieval period, Mary Carruthers begins with a biblical understanding of recollection. According to her, the injunction to remember, to be mindful of, is a characteristic of the Hebrew Bible. Carruthers uses Psalm 136, "By the rivers of Babylon we remembered Zion." To her, this memory of Zion is a remembrance of that which is to come. This notion of eschatological recollection is also woven into Augustine's De Civitate Dei. John Zizuolas describes the Christian praxis of recollecting the future in his Remembering the Future toward an eschatological ontology. Zizuolas' work draws on scripture, early church praxis, from extant liturgical texts like the Didache, and historical and contemporary Eastern Orthodox liturgy. Zizuolas concludes that liturgical anamnesis is a celebration not only of the past, but of the future. In the Eucharist, both the past and the future acts of Christ are remembered and celebrated. According to him, Eucharist is not simply eschatology is not simply a doctrine, it is an orientation, a perspective, a mode of existence. Eschatology does not only concern the future, it affects our past as well as our present. In this lecture, I have explored some implications of a constructivist model of memory for liturgical theology. I've also argued that an enactivist, constructivist model of memory best explains liturgical anamnesis as a participatory recollection which reconstructs the gathered into Imago Dei, and wherein both the past and the future are recollected and celebrated. By so doing, I hope I've also demonstrated the importance of a philosophically and scientifically rigorous model of memory to theology, just one of Augustine's key insights. I look forward to your comments and your questions. Thank you.
So we've got some time for questions. If you've got a question, please wait until the microphone reaches you. I'll come around the room and hand the microphone to anyone who wants to ask a question. The microphone will not make you speak louder. It just means we can capture your response or your comment or your question on the recording. So the first question I can see is Andrew Pinson there in the first row.
Thank you very much, Buki. It got me thinking a lot there. And one thing I wanted to ask you about was, what are we remembering? We're certainly not remembering anything like a cinema, because it's that would be like the Plato's wax tablet. We don't try to actually reconstruct first century Israel when we celebrate the Eucharist. And the Passover Seder did not try to reconstruct exactly what happened in the exile from Egypt. So it is. Perhaps you could say a little about it's not a historical reconstruction exactly, but the history is based on history. What are the other elements added to it, and how does that emerge? Thank you very much.
I don't know if I will do justice to that question. It's a great question. I will draw on Zizuolas, because he does look a lot at Jewish practice to put forward his view of what's happening in Eastern Orthodox liturgical praxis. And he says what is been remembered in Paschal, in the celebration, in the Passover celebration, is the future deliverance. So for him, it's not just the past deliverance that has been remembered. It is the fact, it's the deliverance that is to come, that is also been celebrated and been remembered. I mean, it's an argument, and it's not my area of expertise, but I'm just drawing on Zizuela's to answer that.
I may not have understood you, but I think at one stage you said that God is infinite, and the question is, how can there be comprehension of any sort of the infinite?
Mm.
We stand on a beach and look at the ocean. We only see a small part of it.
Yes.
We are intellectually aware of the fact that there's much more.
Yes.
You don't need to see the infinite to be aware
Yes.
of the full magnitude of something or other. So that there isn't really a difficulty in understanding how the finite mind can see a finite element of the infinite.
Yes. You've touched on one of the things that motivates, I would say, my thinking, not just my thesis. It's something I've always been obsessed about. So again, I don't know if I will be able to answer it fully. What I will say is the first view that you gave, that you can appreciate from finitude that the infinite exists, is I think Paul Ricoeur gives that kind of argument, and he argues from perception, the limitations of perception, to argue that we know that to view something, that we cannot view all of it, and that tells us that the infinite exists. It's a very interesting argument. I think for Augustine, and I don't want to overly read into him on this one, because he only alludes to it. He does talk a lot about infinite, and the fact that his mind, his interior world, is infinite, and that his memory is also infinite. He talks about that a lot. And so because of that, I've often wondered, why does he need to specify the infiniteness of it, as it were? And I really do think it's that, but it's not because of the size of God, because it's not something to do with dimension. For him, the soul isn't extended in space or at all. So it's a different kind of infiniteness that God has anyway. But I wonder if it's to do with the acts of God. So to leave room for the potentially infinite number of encounters he could have with God. He's specified that the spatio-temporal dimensions of his interior world is infinite. But I think it's to do with acts rather than just, I know I said boundless being, but in a lecture like this, you can only summarize things and condense ideas. But I really do think that for him it's to do with acts, because he talks a lot about encounters and activities. So I wonder if that's just what it is, that such that there is enough space there. But it's also a paradoxical thing for him, because when you get to the, there's a point in Book 10 where he says he finds where truth itself is, and also the animus dimension of his soul. So the rational, thinking, intelligible dimension. And then when he goes past this point, he says, where is God? But he's just told us that he's just seen God. And then he says, I must leave this, my interior world, to find God. And in other work, he does that. There is an ascension that happens. Then he eventually meets God in another world. So it's a paradoxical thing that that he even encounters God there. So he does understand that I think that there are limitations, but he also wants to leave room, I think, for the infinite, potentially infinite number of encounters he could have with God and be able to account for that.
Thank you very much. Your presentation was fascinating, and I am delighted that it was said that they could excise any questions which were absolutely foolish, because you have more degrees than I have fingers, and there are many learned rabbis behind me who know much more about Judaism. But while you were speaking, I was thinking very much about the Passover Seder, which is a construction of memory. We're required to remember something all the days of our lives. And in fact, the narrative around the Passover Seder, we don't actually get into the story at all, whether Pharaoh was wearing his pajamas during the plague of frogs or anything like that. And we talk about the memories of numbers at the sea and the magnitude of God. And it's definitely calling upon us to construct memories. We have two ideas of memory that come out through this. One is Zecher Korban, the memory of the destruction, which we have, which is a little bit like Zecher L'Tziat Mitzrayim, remembering the Exodus from Egypt. But Zecher L'Chorban is a memory in our houses and before us always of the fact of the destruction of the temple. It's something that was and is tragic. Yeah. And at the same time in the Seder, we have Zecher L'Mikdash Kehillel. We do that which Hillel used to do at the time of the temple, and we reenact it in order to create a memory of hope for the future. Yes. Jewish liturgy or commentators, when they talk about God remembering, talk about it always being in a hopeful sign, a salvation point. God remembering Noah, God remembering Rachel, etc. This is memory to save, and so we have this idea of memory being very constructive, as well as fact-based. And that leads to the question, which is...
Yes.
The tension between memory in a biblical sense on recollection and the impact that has on the way we use the word memory today, and the idea of not bearing false witness, which is about testimony, about that which actually was, and a tension which is supposed to guide us to be absolutely faithful and non-constructive in our recollection.
Yes. Firstly, thank you so much for that first part. I took notes. That's very, very helpful, much more than you know. Thank you. The second one is, again, a huge area, because I began by differentiating memory of events from memory of facts. So I was very concerned about events. But yes, even within an event, you could say something, you could lie about something happening. I'm going to go back to Augustine for help. For him, he has this very interesting idea that it is God who guarantees the veracity of his knowledge. So truth or falsity is from God, and is via this idea of divine illumination. So God, if something has been illuminated by God, then it's true. If it hasn't been, then it's false. I don't know if as a scientist I could use that for in my own defense. And this is something I've been thinking about a lot. What some of the simulationist theorists say is they don't use false or true when it comes to memory anymore. They use successful or unsuccessful remembering. So they would judge. So something, I guess, I don't want to use true, but let's say you've just talked about false testimony. So something would be false testimony if it came from if the motives were wrong. But if we're looking at it on a process level, because there are false memories, genuinely false memories, where people think something happened and it didn't, or even when they were there and they remembered it in a very different way. So a simulationist theorist would say that it's because of a malfunction in the simulation process. There is a disruption there somewhere, and that is the process that guarantees whether the memory is successful or unsuccessful. But when it comes to, it goes outside of my field, talking about false testimony versus true testimony, I guess. I'm trying to avoid the question, but I'll take a stab at it. Because it's something I've been thinking about a lot, because if you say that memory just is imagination, what then, I can just come in here and describe a very different day that I had yesterday, and then you would have to believe me because memory just is imagination. I think there are many things that many factors here. First, in terms of liturgy, I think this is where group remembering is important, that it is a shared activity and that it is one spread over time and space. But that itself, it can be reconstructed. So I mentioned master narrative. That's a huge area of my work, which I didn't go into, in that there is such a thing as a master narrative, which is a shared construct within a community. But the master narrative itself changes and changes form over time. But that doesn't mean it stops being true. It is still true in what it serves, in the role it serves in the community, and in how it gives them hope. But I think with false testimony, which I'm trying to avoid because it's not my area, we have to go to intention, which I again didn't want to go into this intentionality. So maybe that's where you look at, is someone wanting to deceive, and that's where false testimony comes in. So we do have to look at intentionality, which is a huge area, and I really did not want to raise. But again, that's why the communal aspect is so important, because there is an idea in some Eastern religions about shared intentionality, where a group comes together and then they have one intention, and then they use that to talk about the causal connection with actions. And I haven't done that here, but maybe I need to, because then it would help to be able to say what is deception versus what is true. And also, I'm trying very hard not to use falsity and truth, because of, rather than just successful remembering and unsuccessful remembering. I haven't answered that question to the best of my ability, mainly because it's something that I am really wrestling with at the moment. So thank you.
First, thank you very much for your presentation. It was very interesting for me, especially as a trauma therapist, because in trauma therapy, the fact that memory is constructive is what helps people get over the trauma, because you can reconstruct the memory and look at it in many ways. So you don't have to remember what we might call facts. So in that sense, it was very helpful for me. I have a question about prayers and liturgy and what you mentioned. When we think about the memory as a reconstructive realm where people can reconstruct things, so I started thinking, isn't it wrong for us to have a closed version of prayer? Because we need to reconstruct it again and again. Or isn't it wrong for us? Because just like in the Jewish Pesach, when, as you said, we don't have the story, so we need to reconstruct it. And a caged prayer with the same words and the same vision, or a vision, when we look at Da Vinci's last meal, and we have the vision, so we are not able to reconstruct it in our minds because we have a vision. So in a sense, your lecture is undermining formal prayers and formal ways of thinking, in order for, and it restricts us from having the reconstruction that we need to have of the vision of God, the vision of things that have happened. I wonder if you can say something about that.
Yeah, no, I love that question. Again, I don't know if I'm going to be able to answer it properly. I just really love it, though. Thank you. I've been recently ordained, so a lot of what I do is set prayers. And I've never thought of it in that way before. But I wonder if that will help me answer this question. In that we say prayers, but then the way that the actions around it, again, the gathering, what we imagine when we hear those words are different. They're not set. I don't think I've ever had the same kind of Eucharistic experience ever. I mean, I probably have similar emotions around it, similar ideas, but each one is unique. And here I'm thinking of an idea by Catherine Pickstock on non-identical repetition. So there is an idea that, yes, you can repeat something, but it's not the same. And I wonder if set prayers are that, or even the Psalms, because I say the Psalms in rotation, and I don't think I look at them and think, this feels exactly like it did when I said it yesterday. It's a different experience, and it's a different circumstance that I've brought it into. I think that's why I was very, very keen to stress the enactivist dimension of it. And I didn't say enough, but I do think a lot of the gestures we make, the kneeling, the standing, the smells, the turning around, the things we see, all of that also are constitutive of that experience, that liturgical action, not just what we say or what we imagine in our heads. So all of our experiences and all the richness of that are also constitutive of liturgical action. Thank you very much for the insight on trauma and memory. Thank you.
We have time for 2 final points, 3 if they're very short. Yours was an intervention, so I'll give you the microphone, and maybe we'll have to...
No, it's just on the comment on false memories.
Yes.
Do you think there are genuine false memories? Do you think people construct those false memories quite deliberately? I remember years ago, I was actually a witness in a court case.
Okay.
And a few of the witnesses agreed with me and a few didn't agree with me. But their memories and what they said happened couldn't have happened.
Yes.
So luckily, when the court case was over, it was our testimony that won the case.
Yes.
Now, I was very annoyed at this at the time. Why would people be so incredibly dishonest?
Yes.
But what I did was I did a sort of a thought experiment on myself. There's a film called The Spy Who Loved Me. And at the beginning of the movie, he's coming down a mountain, and he goes off the mountain, and he lets his shoe off, and it's a Union Jack. You know, very cool, very, very Cold War.
Yeah.
And he lands into a submarine and goes off.
Yes.
I deliberately tried to misremember that scene.
Yes.
Where there was involved an aeroplane.
Yes.
I remember if I recall that movie and I recall my false memory, they have exactly the same feeling on me, the same subjective feeling.
Okay.
The only reason why I know they're different is because I have the additional proposition that I deliberately implanted a false memory into myself.
Yes. Yeah.
Now, if I was under stress and I had to take in information very, very quickly and I couldn't sort it, could I develop a real false memory? Or could a situation happen where I've done something bad or I'm trying to protect someone?
Yes.
So I deliberately remember it wrong.
Yes. Yes.
So then it does become a memory, and then it does become inseparable from what a genuine memory would be.
Yes. Yeah. No, again, an absolute brilliant question. I think if you haven't read it, I really do recommend Bartlett's book on remembering, because it does. Because I look at it mainly from a cognitive neuroscience, so what's happening in the brain. He looks at it from a psychology perspective. Why are people remembering things like this? And I wonder if you will touch on that. I find that experimenting yourself very interesting. I do think there are many factors. I've simplified what is a very complex process. There's so very many factors at play on how we remember and how we reconstruct. It's not just voluntary. Most memory isn't voluntary. Things just pop up into our heads. So a lot of it has to do with so many other processes. And that's a great point, that maybe people deliberately fool themselves until that memory appears to be true to them. That's a great point. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and I would like to address the problem of the idea of false witness.
Yes.
And I wonder if you did an experiment in distinguishing between reflecting memory, meaning I have a memory that affects my actions and my feelings and my experience, and convincing someone else. And then it becomes his memory through me, meaning a witness comes and then the judge visualize the testimony. It becomes the judge's memory,
Yes.
and then he decides according to that.
Yes.
So actually, if there is a process like this, and the same constructive memory, the process is in the brain of the judge, in the mind of
Yes.
the judge, then false witness should be intentionally twisting this scene in the eye of the judge, not
Yes.
in my own eyes, but it's not a reflective false witness. There is no reflective false witness. It's impossible. It's self-contradictory. It's trying to plant a false memory in someone else.
Okay, yeah. That's I mean, I didn't touch on something called perspectival flexibility in memory. I talked mainly from first-person perspective. So there is this idea that, for example, when you remember this tomorrow, you can remember it from where you're sat, or you can remember it from where I'm sat. So we're quite flexible in how we imagine and how we remember. And yes, so it makes sense that you can then maybe on some level influence someone and make them feel that they remember something that hasn't happened. It's a good point. Again, it's more in psychology than neuroscience, but I think it's a great point that connects well with false testimony, which is not my area, but it is making me think I need to look at it more and more seriously. Thank you.
One final question from Alexander Norman.
Thank you very much. Stephen Priest at Blackfriars, whom many people here, perhaps, or at least some people here will know, often speaks about presence as the presence of God, in terms of the presence of God.
Yes.
I wondered, with this idea of remembering the future, whether we could say in some sense that the present is in some sense the memory both of the past and of the future.
Okay, yes. That's what constitutes the presence of God, that interruption of the past by the future. I like it. I think something could be said there for sure, because at a point I mentioned God's beyond timeness, as it were. So yes, maybe an aspect of that is, I don't want to say that yes, just because it's not something that's occurred to me before, but also because I feel that God's ontology probably goes beyond time. So, and that is very is constituted by time and space. And I want to say that God's presence is more than that. But I think it's a great point. I think what I'm leaning towards is to say that the presence, if is constituted in part by the people gathered there. That's why I said, as it were, they become transubstantiated. So I think maybe all of those things are the things that maybe together then form God, the presence of God.
Was that the future is as constitutive of the present as the past?
Oh yes, yes. I said it hesitatingly because time is huge. You can imagine in a work like this, yes. And even in our psyche, there's no such thing as the now. So what we have is the past giving way to the future. Or the future, yes, depending on how you're viewing it. Yeah, so yeah, but it's a very big question that you've asked, and that would be another lecture, I think, maybe given by you.
That's all we have time for. One thing that I would add is that from a different point of view, it may look like it's always now, or that it's never not now, regardless of how we look at the dynamic between the past and the future. But before we finish, I've got two things to say. Point number one is that tomorrow at Blackfriars Hall, just down the road at 5 p.m, we'll have a lecture in the same series by two winners of the Oxford Essay Prize in Philosophy, Laszlo Bernath and Tamas Pár, and they're going to speak on the topic on our right to believe in values, obligations and moral responsibility. So if you're interested in that topic, that's going to be taking place at 5 p.m. at Blackfriars Hall, just down the road at St. Giles. The second thing I wanted to say is that there's still some refreshments out there, and we'll be able to mingle and talk to our speaker today for another few minutes easily before we're going to ask you politely to leave at some point. But there's still some time, and there's going to be wine brought through. But before that happens, please join me in thanking our speaker, Buki Fatona, once again for a wonderful evening.